Welcome to our Zoom lessons on the story of Jesus. My name is Jamie Knapp, and in this lesson, we will focus on Bethlehem lodging. Let's share the screen so we can get to the PowerPoint slides. In Luke chapter 10, a parable of Jesus is provided for us where Jesus talks about what we typically call the Good Samaritan. A man is traveling alone on a road from Jerusalem to Jericho. He's attacked by robbers and left for dead. A priest walks by, doesn't help the man. A Levite walks by, doesn't help the man. But then a Samaritan individual walks by and he stops and he helps the man. He bandages his wounds, he puts him on his donkey and takes him to an inn. He leaves money with the innkeeper and along with instructions to take care of this man. I'll be back through at some point in the future. If you bear any expense beyond what I've given you to care for this injured individual, you let me know when I come back through and I'll pay you for it. The significance of this story for our study is that in Luke chapter 10, verse 35, Luke used the word innkeeper. Now, if we return to Luke chapter 2, the story of the birth of Jesus, in verse 7, we read this. And Mary gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. I'm reading from the New American Standard Version. King James Version also has the word inn. The Message uses the word hostel. The New International Version uses the words or the expression guest room, and the New Living Translation uses the most generic of the words, and that is simply lodging. So it's not completely clear what kind of lodging was available. But scholars point out to us that Luke knew the Greek word for innkeeper because he used it in chapter 10, but he didn't use it in chapter 2. And so the idea that Joseph and Mary arrive in Bethlehem and Joseph begins searching for a room at the inn is probably not accurate. Further, the idea that there was an unscrupulous innkeeper who tricked Joseph into paying money for space in a barn where he and Mary would sleep with the animals, that's probably not accurate either. Keep in mind that Bethlehem was a small village. A couple dozen extended families lived in Bethlehem, scholars tell us, and they were, in all likelihood, they were peasant families, so they weren't wealthy. And this small village probably didn't have an inn. So Joseph was simply looking for a place that he and Mary could sleep. It's quite likely that he went door to door, asking homeowners if they had some space to spare in their home. How many homes did he have to go to before he found a space? It's unclear. But eventually, one homeowner offered them space with the animals. And from that, we get the idea that, well, Jesus must have been born in a barn or in an outbuilding or in a shed or lean-to or something along those lines. And that's probably not the case. Allow me to stop the share of this screen and let's look at a picture. And it may give us information that would be quite helpful. Archaeologists have uncovered several foundations, such as this one. This is a house, the foundation of a house, and you'll notice that it is stone. So if we follow along, let me see if I can get the best angle we can. I'm going to move the cursor along, and you can follow, if you will, as I'm moving across the top. All of these stones represent the foundation of the house. probably the front of the house. And the foundation would have continued down the right side, the left side, and across the back. But this would have been the foundation. And then there's a large area here, and I realize this big thing in the middle is getting in the way, but we'll talk about it in a moment. But if you can, again, follow the cursor as it moves, all of this space would be a large living area. And then if you notice, from here, there's a step down. Come on the other side of this, you may be able to see it even better. From here to here, there's a step down. And the way that the house of a peasant family in that area and in that time period would have been built was to have a room where the people stayed, which would have been up here, and a room where the animals stayed, which would have been back here, the step down. Families that had a little more wealth might have added a third room on the ground floor, or it's more likely that they would have built some steps into the side of the house, and then they would have had an upper room, a guest room. You might recall that the night before Jesus' crucifixion, he and his apostles were observing the Passover, and they were doing that in the guest room or the upper room of a family. And so those who had a little more wealth would have had that upper room. And in all likelihood, that's what Joseph was hoping to find, a spare room, a guest room. If he couldn't find a guest room, he would have settled in all likelihood for something in this area where the people were staying, just a little bit of space over in this area or over in this area. He ended up having to accept some space back here where the animals stay. But given the lack of options, that was the best thing he could find. Now, this big thing in the middle, and again, it's a little bit out of proportion because of how close the camera was to it. This is a manger. Unlike the image we might have of a little wooden sort of cradle-looking thing about shin high that would have sat in the middle of the floor, this is what a manger really looked like. Often the manger was built into the house itself. And of course, it would have been made out of stone. And you can see the indentation here, which is where the food would have been placed for the animals. This was basically the feeding trough. So the food would have gone in here, the animals would have stuck their head into that area and eaten from it. If the manger was not built into the floor of the house, it would have been built into the side of the house, into one of the walls. And so when Jesus was wrapped in cloths and placed in the manger, again, it wasn't in a little wooden thing that sat down on the floor around, maybe shin high, perhaps knee high. It would have been something made of stone, either built directly into the floor or attached to the wall. Now let's get back to the PowerPoint slides. So Joseph was able to find space for he and Mary, but it was with the animals. Now let's talk about the actual birth of Jesus and the events surrounding that. Perhaps you have seen a nativity scene. Perhaps you've seen a live nativity scene where a church might have a little lean-to built in front of their building, and they have some hay, and they have real people who dress up like the characters, like Joseph and Mary, and they have a little pretend baby that they put in a little wooden manger, and they have some animals, some sheep, and maybe a cow or two, and they're doing their best to depict the time and the arrival of baby Jesus. If you haven't seen one of those, you maybe have seen a plastic one in someone's front yard. Perhaps you have a nativity scene on the mantle above your fireplace or on a coffee table that you put out around Christmas time. We want to try to piece together what we know of the events of the actual arrival of Jesus. And in doing so, you might find that our image of what the nativity scene really looked like may have been culturally embellished. So if we want to get the story of the birth of Jesus, we're not going to find any details in the Gospel of Mark, and we're not going to find any details in the Gospel of John. They go directly to Jesus' adult life. We will find the details in Matthew chapter 2 and Luke 2, but we have to merge them. In other words, some assembly is required if we want to get all of the details in place. If we want the angels and the shepherds, as in the angels came to the shepherds and told them that the baby was born, that's in Luke chapter 2, verses 8 through 20. If we want the part about the wise men, or what sometimes they're called the magi, that would be in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. We know that wise men came. The Bible doesn't tell us how many wise men, but we know there were three gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so when nativity scenes are assembled, oftentimes it's just assumed, well, there must have been three wise men because there were three gifts. But that detail does not exist. What we do know from Matthew chapter 2, verse 8, is that King Herod was the king of Judea. He instructed the wise men to report back to him once they had found Jesus, the baby Jesus. Because according to verse 8 of Matthew 2, Herod said, well, I want to worship him too. But God told the wise men, don't do that. Don't go back to King Herod. You go back by a different way to your home. And when Herod realized that he had been duped, that the wise men did not come back and tell him where Jesus was, he was enraged and he went ballistic. And this is where we will stop this lesson. In our next lesson, we want to focus on Herod and do what we can to understand who he was and why he did what he did. I hope you can join us.